Okay, hello and welcome everybody to the International Longevity Centre UK's webinar on diversity and inclusion in housing with care, hosted in collaboration with the University of Bristol. My name's Tom Scharf and I'm Professor of Social Gerontology at Newcastle University, where I also direct our Centre for Ageing and Inequalities. And it was also my pleasure to be chair of the advisory group of the DICE project on which this webinar is based. So thanks everyone for joining today. We're really pleased that so many people have signed up and are able to join us. What we're going to be doing is discussing ILC UK's new report, which outlines findings from the Diversity in Care Environments study, also called the DICE study, which focuses on diversity and social inclusion in housing with care and support. We're joined today by an expert panel of speakers who will be offering their responses to the findings and recommendations of the report. And we also will then provide ample time for you to ask your own questions in the Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. Before we introduce the key findings from the report, there are a few housekeeping rules that I've been asked to run through. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that has chat next to it. This is a button where you can communicate with panelists and delegates, not to be confused with the Q&A button. So the Q&A button is where we can collect specific questions targeting the speakers and panel members. For those of you who are using Twitter, please post comments using the hashtag inclusive neighbourhoods, and also the handle @ILC UK. The webinar is being recorded and will be published for public access on the ILC UK website and on its YouTube channel. And the various presentation slides and the recording will be published tomorrow. That sounds really optimistic, doesn't it? But that's how ILC UK operates. They're a tight, well-run machine. So without much further ado, we're going to get on to the key business today, which is, we'll start with the presentation of the major findings from the report. This will be introduced by two of our speakers, Dr. Paul Willis and Dr. Brian Beach. Paul Willis is lead researcher on the DICE study. He's an associate professor of social work and social gerontology at the University of Bristol. He's also head of the Centre for Research in Health and Social Care at Bristol, and a senior fellow of the NIHR School for Social Care Research. The areas that Paul's research focuses on include, obviously, inclusive housing and care provision for older adults, but he's also well known for his work on loneliness, aging and masculinities, sexuality, care and aging, and also trans-aging and gender identity. Paul's a registered social worker and he teaches on the master's degree in social work at the University of Bristol. He'll be presenting alongside Dr. Brian Beach, who's research fellow at the Institute of Epidemiology and Healthcare at University College London. Brian joined UCL last summer in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health. His current work draws on data from the English longitudinal study of aging collected during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, and he has a special focus there on social connections and dementia. Before moving to UCL, Brian worked at the ILC UK for 8 years, conducting research on a wide range of topics, including questions around loneliness, inequalities, and retirement communities. He has particular expertise and interests in employment in later life. So there we have our introductions. I'm now going to pass it straight over to Paul, who'll start, and then Brian will follow on. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Tom. And while I've led this research study, I would like to acknowledge that it has been a team effort, and would like to recognise all my colleagues on the DICE team in the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol, and the people we've worked with through our collaborators with Housing Lin and ILC UK. With Brian, it's my pleasure to present some of the key findings from the policy report and to talk through some of the recommendations contained within the report. Next slide, please. So some background context. We know that an ageing population brings particular pressures and priorities across policy areas. And one of those key priority areas is ensuring that there is good enough and sufficient enough housing for older people to age well in across the UK. So we're interested in housing with care schemes, and we know that this is a form of housing that is growing and expected to continue to increase. But we know in terms of research and policy, there are gaps in knowledge about how these living environments support older people from different social minority backgrounds. So this project, the DICE project, has been a 3-year study funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and in collaboration with ILC UK and Housing Lin. We have looked at social inclusion practices and approaches and experiences of social inclusion across housing schemes for older people. And these are schemes that provide some form of care and support on site. And this includes extra care schemes, independent living schemes, and some schemes known as, or formerly known as, sheltered housing. We focused mainly on older adults, adults who were 60 years of age and over, and we had a specific focus on residents within these schemes who identified as social minority groups. So when we talk about social minority groups, we're talking about people who identify with social characteristics and identities that are sometimes marginalized or subject to discrimination. For our study, this included people with learning and physical disabilities, people with dementia, people identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans, people identifying with Black and minority ethnic groups, and members of minority religious groups. Next slide, please. Briefly, how do we do the research? This was a mixed method study across 2 phases. We commenced in 2019, pre-pandemic, and we commenced with a hard copy questionnaire for residents to complete. So we distributed this questionnaire to over 3,600 units across 104 schemes. And these are schemes provided by 3 housing providers in England and Wales. And we were really fortunate to have 741 questionnaires received from across 95 schemes. So these were questionnaires completed by people currently living in housing with care schemes. And then we commenced longitudinal interviews in early 2020. And these were a series of interviews over 18 months with residents from minority groups, from some of the groups that I mentioned before. And we focused specifically on this group to make sure that we did capture diverse experiences across social differences and different identities. So we had 21 residents who took part in at least 1 interview, 4 people who took part in 2 interviews, and 14, the majority, who took part in all 3 interviews. And finally, we had single interviews, semi-structured interviews with staff across 8 housing schemes, with residents across 8 housing schemes, including some follow-up interviews once we got through the first lockdown in 2020, and 23 interviews with stakeholders. And these were people who were involved in commissioning housing with care and policy making around housing, around design, architecture, and people who represent advocacy organisations for different groups of older people. And we did, of course, had to adapt our interview approaches, our research approaches during the lockdowns in 2020. We moved to remote interviews. And again, we're very fortunate that both staff, residents were happy to continue to be involved. I'll now hand over to Brian, who's going to talk us through the survey findings.
Great, thanks, Paul. You can go ahead and, thanks. So as Paul was just talking about, we had this mixed method approach, and the first stage of this was this hard copy questionnaire we distributed. I'm going to go through sort of what we see as three of the most salient findings from the results of this questionnaire. The survey we distributed was intended to mirror many of the questions you find in the English longitudinal study of aging. And we did this with intent so that we could apply some more advanced approaches to really identify the impact that just living in this kind of housing has on a population. So we're able to create these matched samples between our survey and results from the English longitudinal study of aging. And that's how we get this finding you see on the screen here, which we've got some really strong evidence that living in this housing with care reduces loneliness. Loneliness is measured on a scale, and what we really find is we were able to measure loneliness as reported by our respondents, and we were able to estimate using ELSA what those people would have scored on loneliness had they been part of ELSA in a way. And in doing this, we see this treatment effect is what it's called. And so we see this lower score of loneliness for people living in housing with care. Next slide, please. We also, in addition to the kind of standard questions we gather through the ELSA study, we also asked some particular questions related to people's perceptions of housing, because this was a housing study. And in this context, you see on the screen here, one of the key findings around people's perception of positive opportunities for socialization. So you can think of this as the extent to which living in this housing can facilitate social inclusion. And quite positively, we see a vast majority, almost approaching 2/3 of residents who agree that their schemes provide these positive opportunities to socialize. Next slide, please. And the third point we wanted to highlight here, given that we have an interest and focus on social minority groups, is understanding discrimination. So we asked questions on the one hand, we asked people whether they themselves had experienced discrimination in some form, and where they experienced that, why they experienced that. You can find more about that in the report that we've published with ILC today. But we also asked them whether or not they had seen discrimination happen. And in particular, had they seen this discrimination come from staff of the scheme or from other residents. And the finding here really shows that when it comes to the perception or the observation of discrimination happening, you have a much higher proportion seeing this from other residents than staff, which gives us some strong evidence that these efforts to get staff on board with diversity and inclusion is working. So next slide, please. And this just really sums up what I've said here. So we've got evidence that loneliness is reduced for people living in housing with care. And interestingly enough, we also looked at a measure of social isolation, and we found no difference, which goes against some of the narratives or perceptions that people have that by moving into specialist housing, they get cut off from social contacts. There's no strong difference in the groups. And again, good opportunities for social inclusion, although there will always be scope to improve. And about a third of our respondents described experiencing discrimination of some sort. But again, this idea of where they're seeing discrimination happen from residents versus staff shows where more work can be done. So back to you, Paul.
Thanks, Brian. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm now going to highlight some of the salient qualitative findings that chime with the survey findings Brian has just been talking about. So first of all, is housing with care inclusive for people belonging to social minority groups? Well, the good news is that we found across our qualitative research that most residents from social minority groups feel valued and included, but carrying on from the last finding that Brian highlighted about concerns and reports of discrimination from other residents, many anticipated or had experienced discrimination both in the local community and within the scheme in which they were currently based. Next slide, please. So we did find pockets of isolation amongst residents from minority groups. So residents with minority identities talk to us about feeling disconnected from other residents based on their personal interests and differences in terms of life experiences. We found that residents of minority identities tended to look more outward for important social connections with family and friends and groups in the community, more so than inward within the scheme community, and often made active choices to not participate in scheme life. We also found examples of what we've called boundary setting within schemes. And this is where residents, other residents living within the same scheme who don't belong to the same minority groups, through their everyday speech and talk and expressions, conveyed discriminatory or outdated or marginalizing terms and expressions that sometimes made residents of minority groups, such as people who identified as LGB and trans, or people from Black and ethnic minority groups, feel othered or marginalized and outside of the mainstream within the community. And you can see some examples here on the right from some of our residents. We also found examples of exclusion on the basis of disability. And this was a standout point of exclusion from our qualitative study. So we found social exclusion through on the basis of cognitive and learning disabilities. In relation to physical disabilities, residents with physical disabilities told us about the barriers they encountered in areas such as having accessible communication from staff connected to the scheme and from housing providers. And they also talked to us about the barriers they experienced in physical design. For example, being able to access communal spaces if you're a wheelchair user. We also found examples in our interviews of residents who didn't have dementia or were experiencing cognitive decline, examples of exclusionary views expressed towards residents who were experiencing some cognitive decline associated with dementia. So comments like the one on the top on the right there about there being too many people here with high support needs, which can't be accommodated in these kinds of schemes. Next slide, please. From our findings, we also identified a number of important factors from the perspectives of residents that facilitate social inclusion for them. First of all, we want to recognise that residents are active contributors to the social lives of the schemes in which they live. They're not passive recipients of services, but they themselves make a significant contribution to the relationships and the community within which they're based. So we heard about examples of supportive neighbours and being a supportive neighbour, welcoming new residents, setting out invitations to events, assisting others with day-to-day tasks. And that came out through the 2020 lockdowns as well. The importance of being locally connected and embedded within the local community, having social connections already in the local community prior to moving into the scheme. Active participation in scheme life was really important, and there are a number of different ways that this was evident. It could be through more formal roles, such as resident committees and subgroups, through taking part in gardening and green care around the external environment of schemes, or playing a part in welcoming new residents. Residents were also really clear about the importance of on-site staff. Having staff on-site who are consistent and which they were able to build good relationships with. And those staff got to know the residents and were able to encourage their involvement in everyday participation in scheme life. And for those residents who had carers come in on a regular basis to help them with day-to-day tasks, they also talked about the importance of the intimate connections they built with their carers. And the carers told us about the ways in which they were able to notice when residents became more withdrawn and how they played a role in checking in on the welfare of residents. Next slide, please. From the, can we go back a slide, please? Thank you. From the perspective of scheme staff, we know that residents really valued rapid and responsive staff, and it was really important that staff had a shared ethos of equality and equal participation, both amongst the staff groups, but also amongst the resident groups as well. We heard good examples of staff noticing when residents were isolating themselves or socially withdrawn, and actively responding and identifying proactively ways of making residents feel more included and connected to the scheme which they belonged, or perhaps addressing the source of conflict and isolation. And they played a fundamental role in keeping residents connected during lockdowns. And this is through daily welfare checks or through group activities such as doorstep exercises. Next slide, please. And we also learned that there are some really important factors to consider in terms of the physical design and infrastructure of schemes. Balconies and garden patios played a really important role as external spaces that facilitated regular social interaction between residents. And these spaces became even more important during the 2020 lockdowns, where residents were having to isolate, and they became important spaces in which they were able to connect with their neighbours and others in the scheme on a regular basis. So communal spaces were really important sites for facilitating interaction, everyday conversation, and even more critical during lockdowns. Where some schemes didn't have communal spaces available, for example, older housing stock where this wasn't part of the original design, we found that residents often created their own informal communal areas. So for example, using car parks for meeting and having a conversation, having a barbecue, or laundries as regular social spaces. But sometimes communal areas and rooms could be occasional sites of resident conflict and spaces where some residents felt excluded from scheme life because of the actions of small groups of residents. So staff had a really critical role here in being able to quickly respond to these forms of conflict and helping to resolve these matters. And digital infrastructure was really important. Again, and this became even more apparent during the lockdown, but residents talked to us about the importance of being able to text and email friends and family on a regular basis and how important video calls were during the lockdowns of 2020. Next slide, please. There are a number of different barriers we identify in the report, barriers to social inclusion and get in the way of residents staying connected to each other and to staff. And these are just a few to highlight. As I've already touched on, the lack of social activities and communal spaces, having a limited repertoire of scheme activities. For example, some residents talked about activities on site being more appealing to heterosexual women than to other groups. Having a lack of staff on site, and this was particularly a barrier for residents who required some additional support to attend events. So for example, those residents with physical disabilities. And the formation of dominant resident groups have sometimes created no-go zones, particularly around communal areas or access to the scheme for some residents who felt marginalised and isolated because of the actions of others. So some key messages from stakeholders. And this chimes of what we'd established when we set up this project, that there is a growing demand for a range of age-friendly and inclusive living environments. We know this is an important priority area, and that older people's housing needs and aspirations should be driving this as a national housing policy priority. But there's a current lack of integration of housing priorities and planning across national social care, health, and equalities policy. And I would add to that at a local policy level as well. And there are current restricted choices. And we heard a key comment from stakeholders that many private developers and providers are unwilling to enter this market for publicly provided housing with care and support. So through the report, based on these findings, we've identified a number of different recommendations for different audiences. I'm just going to highlight some key recommendations here. First of all, for national government. We think it's important for the government to provide financial incentives to make proposals for new housing with care schemes more attractive to potential developers and providers. And some examples here could be grant funding for specialist housing and to encourage more older people to consider and to move into these schemes. We also believe it's important to improve coordination between different government departments on housing with care policy. And this includes setting up a housing with care task force. And here we're echoing the recommendations that have already been set out by the associated retirement community operators. For local government, we think it's important that local governments promote access to independent information and advice on the housing options available to older people in their local area. That local governments work with providers and designers to create inclusive, age-friendly design and set out equality standards that are subject to continual review and monitoring, and connect these standards to the commissioning of new housing schemes. And we believe these standards should include inclusive design features, and I'd like to flag up the HAPI design principles here as particularly important, and also make sure that these include equality principles that are in line with the Equality Act 2010. And this should include requirements such as holding resident forums and for training on the lifetime inequalities experienced by those who belong to social minority groups. For designers and architects, we think it's critical to integrate social inclusion into the built environment of housing with care and support schemes, into the external and internal communal spaces, and the importance of having a really good digital infrastructure that's accessible to all. And it's really important to involve older people early on in the design of these kinds of schemes, particularly disabled adults and people with care and support needs. And finally, there are a number of key recommendations for housing providers, scheme managers and staff. And the first one may seem really obvious, but it's really important to restate this, the importance to listen to and gather the views of residents about their experience of scheme life, and to identify proactively practices that get in the way of social inclusion. The importance of actively involving residents in decisions on future plans for schemes, especially those residents at greater risk of exclusion. And this would encompass people belonging to the minority groups that we've touched on today. The importance of prioritising the location of staff on-site rather than off-site to build consistent and durable relationships with residents. And perhaps this goes counter to some more recent models where providers have provided floating support through staff rather than having regular staff on site. And the importance of setting out expectations for new residents to contribute to a culture of inclusion and encourage residents to reflect on what it means to be a good neighbour, particularly before they enter the scheme and become part of the communal life in the scheme. Finally, it's my pleasure to flag up that as well as the policy report that's been launched by ILC, Housing Lynn has created a dedicated website for the DICE project. And we've launched today a series of podcasts that capture the experiences and voices of residents from diverse groups. So residents who identify with Black and minority ethnic groups, or with minority faith groups, and who identify as lesbian, gay, and transgender. And we've created a learning resource for housing providers and for managers and staff to accompany those podcasts. And that includes learning questions to facilitate training and awareness raising across staff groups and across scheme life. We also have on the site other useful resources, more about the DICE study, including a short film about how we did the study and some of the key findings that we've touched on today, and a way to get back in touch with us. And I just want to finish by saying a very big thank you to all the residents who gave us their time to take part in the study and contribute their views by a survey and interview, and all the staff who also gave us their time and conveyed their experiences.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Paul and Brian, for an excellent overview of a report. And it's impossible to do justice in a relatively short time to the wealth of material and the insights that are reflected in that report. So I'd strongly recommend reading the full document to anybody who's joined the session, but also people well beyond the session. There's something here for everybody. Now, as Paul's just said, a central part of the project has been reflecting the views of residents of housing with care and support schemes across and throughout the project. And before we get to the panel, we're going to hear from Carol Beaumont, who is a local housing resident in Southeast Wales. And she has been part of the advisory group that I've been chairing with the DICE project, along with other residents of housing schemes. And Carol is a keen and a passionate poet, and she is going to give us the benefit of her creativity and read for us a short poem that she has written. So over to you, Carol.
Oh, thank you, Tom. Yes, I'm Carol. I'm 75. I live in Newport. I lived in Australia for 25 years, managing hotels, motels, and restaurants. And this is all new to me, but I'm enjoying every minute. And this is called Good Neighbours. Paul, Jill and Alex all work with dice. They want to know if your neighbours are nice. Millions of tenants all over the place, most of them friendly and want to feel safe. Some not so nice, so what do? There must be someone that we can turn to. I live in a bungalow all on my own. I really don't mind. I like living alone. The people in my street are such a mixed bunch. Some you can talk to or invite them to lunch. But what do I do with the neighbour next door? He plays his music from midnight till 4. I asked the neighbour to please turn it down. I think I'll move to a much quieter town. Tenants in buildings that have many flats you can't get away from, and some keeping cats. One man hates neighbours and won't talk at all. He just ignores them when they pass in the hall. Community rooms encourage, come down for fun. Not all are sociable, there's always one. Different nationalities, infirm and old. Some get ignored or stay away, they are told. Some like their bingo, some like their beer. Then there's the others, they won't go near. A lady I know who's really good. For a bit of peace and quiet, she walks through the wood. COVID has landed, it's got so bad. Our lives have all changed, not that one that we had. Hiding in laundries just for a talk. Excuse me, maybe it's better to go for a walk. Let's meet in the garden, that's what we need. You on the one side, me with the weeds. No chat on the stairs or meeting inside. It's not getting me like many that's died. So many people on the one floor, most are afraid to go out their door. But some have no feelings, just couldn't care. They're going out, spreading it everywhere. So what's the solution? What do we do? Is anyone out there that we can turn to? Managers on site, that would be great, to stop any upsets with people who hate. So let's live together without trouble or strife. You might just like it, a new better life. Good friends and neighbours are all that we need. Go into your area and do your good deed. I'm a good neighbour as far as I know, but like everything else, progress is slow. Let's hope this project will help one and all. It's been a pleasure to know you, Jill, Alex and Paul. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Carol. And it's quite unusual for a scientific research project to have a poem written just about it, where you name check some of the key people who've been part of the team. I was very disappointed that I didn't get a name check there, but perhaps you can add an extra verse on at some appropriate moment. So we're now, after that sort of brief interlude, we get onto the panel presentations. So we've invited along some key figures who are able, from their wealth of experience, to reflect on some of the ideas presented in the DICE report and to link that to their own particular areas of interest. And what I'll do is I'll introduce each of the panelists one by one, giving them an opportunity then to talk for sort of 5 to 7 minutes about their own reflections on the work. So we're going to kick off with Baroness Liz Barker. Liz Barker is Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Housing and Care for Older People. She's a Liberal Democrat peer, a member of the health team and spokesperson on charities and social enterprise and LGBT equality. She's a deputy speaker. Liz has worked on a wide range of legislation, including the current Health and Care Bill. She's Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Global LGBTI Rights, HIV/AIDS, and a long-standing member of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Older People and Housing. She's CEO of Third Sector Business, which is a management consultancy specializing in charities and social enterprises. She's a patron of Opening Doors London, an ambassador for Albert Kennedy Trust, and also a trustee of giveout.org. That's quite a remarkable set of responsibilities there, Liz, but we're very keen to hear what you have to say about this particular work. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and gutted to be following a top poet. I can't really follow that, can I, at all? But the only thing that I can hope can save me is that I win the best backdrop competition, because this is live, so people will wander through. I'm actually sitting in the Royal Gallery of the House of Lords, and it may look fantastic, but let me tell you, it's the fanciest fridge in London. It is so cold, I can't tell you. I want to go back over 30 years to Polari housing, the very, very first bit of research that I know of in the United Kingdom, where a bunch of people interested in housing went along and found the very, very few lesbian and gay people. I don't think we actually had any trans people at the time, and asked them the question, what do you want to do? Where do you want to live when you're older? And they asked the question very broadly to include residential care and housing with care schemes and all of that. And I think there are three things that stick out in my mind, and three things that are germane to what we are discussing today. The first was that people were asked, would you like to go and live in a gay only or LGBT only housing complex? And 50% of people said, oh yes, sign me up tomorrow. And 50% of people said, oh dear God, I cannot imagine anything worse. No, 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 no. Okay. Second thing was that I remember sitting in a group full of older lesbians who were specifically talking about whether they could build some kind of housing care support just for lesbians. And it was, you can imagine the discussion. It wasn't that far down the line when we'd gone from things to do with high finance and equity input to, well, would we allow men in at all? Would we allow brothers and cousins and so on in? Would we allow pets? If we had pets, would we have cats? Would we have dogs? You know, whatever. Huge debate, huge debate. And I think the third thing that happened that stuck with me was that when we drilled down into the answers that we got from people said things like, we said to them, how would you know that it was a place that you wanted to live? How would you know as an LGBT person it was a place you wanted to live? And I always remember one guy said, if they've got a picture of Judy Garland up on the wall instead of the Queen Mother, I know it's for me. But the serious point behind all of that was when we talked to providers, they were very hung up on the fact that this was about LGBT people. And what they knew about LGBT people at the time was that we had sex with people that other people didn't. And their whole perception about what LGBT people wanted was around sex. And for when you talk to LGBT people, that was a very, very small, minor part of their life. And I think what has been so good and so valuable in this research, and thank you so much to ILC and to the DICE project for doing it, is that you didn't start out with preconceptions about what people would want. And therefore you have managed to dig down and get to what people actually want, rather than what providers think that they might want. And that is a huge difference and a critical part of it. I'm glad that in the 30 years since that important work, and it was important work back then, we have moved on. We are now in the position where we have got one or two housing schemes. Very good to see Tonic Housing opening up their Bankside house in London, and that they have done so over a very long time in a very inclusive way, talking to people exactly about all of those things that you touched on. What is it that would make this a different kind of housing scheme? One where privacy of individuals is respected, but the communal areas and the feel of the provision is most definitely and distinctively LGBT, but is one in which all sorts of different people who fall underneath those initials and have diversity can feel comfortable. And I was particularly struck by your point about exclusion of people with disabilities. And I say that as somebody who is the child of a deaf person and who understands the very subtle ways in which disability can lead to exclusion. I thought that the recommendations for government and for local government were particularly good and timely. Lord knows getting the Department of Health to talk to people who take decisions about housing is broken a better, many better people than me, but I think we can still go back and try that. And I do think that at a time when the health service is going through this huge transformation and there's supposed to be this massive change to ICSs and a new understanding of the role and importance of community in settings in the wake of what's happened to us all in the pandemic in the last couple of years, I do think that there is an opportunity to look at neighbourhood development, because what nearly everybody wants to do is to live in a neighbourhood where they can rely on services being friendly to them, and that we can, within that, get to a point of setting standards. The final thing that I will say is this: the absolute key to all of this is about those who are involved in setting up the provision being upfront about expectations from the beginning. If you, as an organisation that is doing something, don't come out yourself, then you can't expect individuals to come out to you. And therefore, being upfront about what you believe constitutes an affirming, inclusive scheme, and being upfront about what you believe being a good neighbour looks like in practice is absolutely the key. And designing those two things with the people who are going to live there is the key to getting that right. So thank you for another step along the way to getting us towards the provision that we all, as people, many of whom, 1 million of us, ageing without children, and 2 million of us by 2030, ageing without children, want to see and would like to live in. Thank you.
Thank you, Baroness Barker, for making some incredibly valid and helpful points that also connect so well back to other research that's ongoing around aging without children, but also around how housing providers demonstrate their inclusiveness over and beyond some just written down policies that may or may not be appropriate or implemented in practice. There's a big step there for people to is to develop much more inclusive environments and to indicate how inclusive they are. So thank you for that. We're going to move on now to Jane Ashcroft, who's Chief Executive of Anchor Group. Jane joined Anchor in 1999 from Bupa, which had acquired Care First PLC, where she was personnel director. She became Chief Executive of Anchor in 2010 and has led the organisation through care home acquisitions and also led on the merger with Hanover Housing in 2018, making Anchor England's largest not-for-profit provider of housing and care for older people. Jane joined the Board of Business in the Community in November 2021. She's a Fellow of the Chartered Governance Institute and a member of the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. She was awarded a CBE in the 2013 New Year's Honours for services to older people. So Jane, please, it's over to you now to respond to the report.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I feel my life flash before me with that introduction. She sounds an interesting person. It is a real pleasure to be with you all today. It's great that there's so many people involved in this call, and I warmly welcome the report from ILC and the partners and the findings. I've had a quick read of the report and I'm looking forward to a very thorough read of it going forward, and I'm sure it will be an important piece of work for us all. I'm going to take the time available to I'll give you a quick overview of Anchor, but essentially I want to talk about how we are trying to embrace some of the recommendations from the report and some of the good practice we're seeking to extend. As Thomas said in the introduction, Anchor is a large national provider of housing and care services to older people. We work across England. We work in 85% of local authority areas, and we're currently supporting about 60,000 older people. Most of those people live in our retirement housing services, which are available for rent or for sale. Many of those have extra care facilities too. We're also a large provider of care homes, so we have about 6,000 residents living in our care homes. And when we talk about older people, typically people come and find our services perhaps in their late 60s or early 70s, but many people stay with us for a long time. We currently have 300 centenarians living in our services. So actually, we're supporting several generations of older people, and it's the privilege of my job is the opportunity to get out and about and talk to the amazing residents who live with us and try to learn from them. So one of the interesting, one point I would like to make is that although we focus on older people's services, we're very keen to ensure a culture that is intergenerational and that our services are part of local communities, recognising that people of all generations benefit from effective mixing, and that we have services both in terms of physical environments and other services that local communities can benefit from. I think somebody had mentioned in the Q&A the issue about how we make sure that we're not excluding older people or removing older people from society by creating age-specific services. And I think that's a really important point, and culturally, absolutely something that we are very much focused on, how we make sure we're connected with local communities. And one of the other points that I think in relation to how we support people from social minority groups in the organisation is the rather practical issue of data collection. And I think historically, when I look at the data from our resident group in Anchor, we've had significant gaps in some of our data, which is something we've been seeking to address, both with our residents and with colleagues across the organisation, to make sure we're clear on the groups, how we're engaging with social minority groups. And I know that's an area that many organisations have sought to focus on. I should also say, for full disclosure, earlier on, ARCO was mentioned, which is the Association of Retirement Community Operators. And we're members of that organisation, and I'm also the Vice Chair of ARCO. And we're very much, the earlier mention was of our call for a task force on older people's housing with care, which we continue to bang the drum for, because we think there's some really critical policy issues, including the issues around providing support for diverse groups that really need to be addressed through policy review. So I'd like to pull out some of the initiatives internally and externally which we've been involved in, which we have found helpful in terms of seeking to develop our approach to social inclusion. And I suppose I start with the values of the organisation. We have 4 values in Anchor, which we talk about all the time and guide the decisions that we make. Those values are that we're accountable, respectful, courageous and honest. And I could give you my full hour on the definitions of those things, but I'm particularly going to talk about our value of respect, which is where we focus when residents join us in new services or when colleagues are recruited to the organisation, that our commitment to respect is about respecting people as individuals. It's about understanding the diversity of every individual who lives with us and seeking to build inclusive environments across the organisation. I was struck in the commentary earlier with the point about recognising resident contribution, something that we work very hard in Anchor to co-produce when we're reviewing policies or looking at new services. But recently, in the last couple of years, we've introduced some resident awards. And the resident awards are very focused on recognising contributions of residents. We have our Best Neighbour Award. Baroness Barker might be interested to hear we do also have a Dog of the Year award because pets are very important to us. But very, very important, I think, to recognise the contribution of residents as members of our communities and the contribution that every individual resident makes to creating an inclusive and diverse environment. We've got a very long established LGBT residents group, and they work very effectively with us to highlight and tackle any concerns that residents may raise, to make sure that we're really understanding the individual needs of our residents. We have worked extensively on how to help people moving into specialist housing communities or indeed care homes, and to make sure that we're demonstrating to people that this should not be and need not be a lonely or isolating experience, and should be an exciting opportunity for people to start the next phase of their lives with us. We were really proud to be involved in funding Houseproud's 2017 report called No Place Like Home, which I'm sure many people on this webinar will be familiar with. And from that report, the Houseproud Pledge Scheme was born, which I think has been one of the useful frameworks in the sector to ensure that residents' needs are being properly met. And we have a residents' council in the organisation, so we have a high number of residents who are engaged with the organisation in many different ways. One member of our National Residents' Council takes a lead on diversity and inclusion issues, and their work is supported by a resident equality, diversity and inclusion specialist within our team. So their workload is very much specified by the resident council and the priorities that they bring to us. And as well as working to make sure we're improving all of the time, to highlight and address concerns, to shape new policy and practice, we also seek to celebrate diversity across the organisation, and to make sure that we are providing positive statements and encouraging people to talk about diversity and inclusion. We have a number of specialist schemes and services, either currently in operation or in development. So we have an extra care service in Brighton called New Larchwood, which is an LGBT affirmative scheme, and we're currently working with the Housing Diversity Network to build links with the local organisations, such as the local LGBT Switchboard and others, to constantly refresh the service that's provided in New Larchwood based on the feedback from our residents there. And last year, in March last year, we were delighted to be chosen as the preferred partner by Manchester City Council to develop their first, and I think one of the UK's first purpose-built, co-produced LGBT older people's housing schemes, which is going to be built at Russell Road in Whalley Range, if anybody knows Manchester. It will be a large extra care scheme consisting of 100 apartments, a mixture of affordable rent and shared ownership tenures. And we're currently working in partnership with local residents, with the LGBT Foundation, with a community steering group made up of local residents and councillors to define exactly the service specification as well as the building specification that we'll be working to. We have a range of other resident groups, including a fabulous sensory awareness resident group. They advise us and co-produce with us approaches to support our residents living with disability. And we do try to take good practice from our service provision activity and our employment practice too. So we have a number of colleague networks around social minority groups, and we've had a really strong reverse mentoring scheme in place recently. I've had several mentors in the organisation, most recently a colleague living with disabilities, and her mentoring of me really gave me a much deeper understanding of some of the challenges facing colleagues living with disabilities and also our residents. And we've been able to make some changes to the way we do things on the basis of some of these very rich relationships. We have specialist services for some groups from ethnic minority backgrounds. So we have a fabulous service for Chinese elders, which we operate in the Northwest in communion with local partners in that area, which gets excellent feedback and I think is again very integrated into the local community. And one of the things that we're trying to do is support the skilling up. We have an online platform called Be Skilled, which our residents are able to access if they're interested in it. We have an EDI training module within our Be Skilled online platform, and that's training that's required for our resident council members, but also something that we're encouraging all of our residents to get involved in, recognising that people, as well as understanding the culture of inclusion and diversity, often also are keen to make sure that they're up to speed and up to date with current issues. And I'm really looking forward later this year to hosting a virtual residents conference focused particularly on diversity and inclusion, bringing together residents from all over the country. So in closing, I'd really like to recommend to support the recommendations that the report produces. I think the recommendations for housing and scheme providers are warmly welcomed, and we'll be seeking to use those and build those into our plans going forward. And I think the recommendations for government are very important. And I note in the Q&A, lots of the questions and issues that people are raising do include housing policy issues and social care reform issues, which are very important in public debate at the moment. One of our priorities at Anchor is to make sure that the voices of diverse older people are heard in these important debates, and we will continue to seek to participate and for our residents to have a strong voice. I really look forward to hearing from the rest of the panel, and it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you very much, Jane, for those really helpful reflections on how a major housing organisation responds to this sort of challenges of an increasingly diverse older population. So we're now going to move on to our next panel member. Jeremy Porteus is the Chief Executive of the Housing Learning and Improvement Network, Housing LIN. Jeremy was previously National Lead for Housing at the Department of Health and was responsible there for its Specialist Housing Capital Fund. On leaving the Department of Health, he founded the Housing LIN, which brings together over 25,000 housing, health and social care practitioners in England, Wales and Scotland, where the focus is on identifying and showcasing innovative housing and technology-enabled solutions for an ageing population. Housing LIN has been a partner on the DICE project and also is hosting the policy report and the various other resources from the project that Paul drew attention to in his presentation. They're being housed on the Housing LIN website. So over to you, Jeremy.
Tom, thanks for that introduction, and it's great to follow Baroness Barker and Jane Ashcroft. We've got a really great segue here in that having been part of the all-party parliamentary group for some years and crafted some of the happy reports that Liz and Lord Best have commissioned, the last year's report was specifically on dementia, which again is picked up on in this report. Something that Anchor generously funded that commission and asked, are we ready yet? And in fact, I think we could extend that, are we ready yet, to issues around diversity. How is our sector ready? And partly, I think this report highlights both some of the entrenched inequalities that have existed, but also gives puts a spotlight on some of the real both strategic solutions, but also the practical solutions. So in terms of my sort of comments, I too welcome this piece of work, a really important one, which really shows how co-production works with academia, practitioners, but importantly residents. And if it wasn't for the residents being able to share their personal views and lived experiences, which really helps sort of flesh out the findings, recommendations, it's a really important step forward, especially when we look back about this inclusive neighbourhoods. It's a term that has been around for a little while. I'm long enough in the tooth to remember back in 2008, in fact, more or less February 2008, so nearly 14 years ago, the Social Exclusion Unit published a report called Lifetime Homes, Lifetime Neighbourhoods. And in fact, what the team have done is pull together a much more contemporary take on some of the entrenched inequalities that were highlighted there to show some of the progress that's been made. And I think some of the questions in the Q&A box and the chat demonstrate that implicitly is this move to a social model of ageing and a social model of disability from one that was probably one around crisis and cure back in 2008 to look at some of the sort of real significant demands in our system. But what the report for me does is to tackle three things. From a philosophical and real important bit, it's about, and Paul mentioned this in his opening comments, it's around equalities and the Equality Act, but it's also around social justice. And I think what it demonstrates is that we do still have some structural barriers in our system, institutionalized in some ways, which do still pervade through various programs, which demonstrate that there's still discrimination and disadvantage in our housing and housing with care. I mean, I should go so bold to say that, in a sense, a lot of our retirement living in the UK is still very much a monoculture. It supports people from a white British background, and we need to unlock that to demonstrate the ability to create that social, much more socially inclusive approach. And this is where I think the report really starts to hit home, because what I really like about it, it's not just the physical architecture that Paul and Brian referred to. And when you read the report, it looks at issues around accessibility, adaptability, the use of technology, how to create better space for inclusive design and universal design, but it's also about the social architecture. So, you know, how to better engage with existing communities, but also new communities as they come through, not just for this generation, but for future generations, about building social connectedness. And again, Brian sort of highlighted, you know, the sort of the opportunities there and some of the expressed views about that in his presentation. And critical to this is about how to maintain and build those relationships so that there's transitions through both the public space, but also individuals' own personal feelings and their lifestyle choices. And really, for me, that's the way that we can then tackle some of the sort of entrenched inequalities and also the housing inequity there is for many social minority groups in being able to access a really good housing in later life. And I'm sure it's something that Abdul will pick up on with some work that we've been doing with him and colleagues in parts of the country to look at different ways that we can unlock some of that choice. But I think the other side of it is at a higher level. I echo what Jane was saying about the call for a task force into retirement living. And I think this has to be built into that, around creating a greater both awareness, but also in terms of enabling policy and strategy across government to come together. And if anything, the happy reports, the work that Baroness Barker, her predecessor, Kay Andrews, and now Lord Best are taking forward, but also working integratedly with health and social care to make sure that we have a much better joined up system. Because it's not just the inequalities in our housing, it's also in our health and social care, as has been exacerbated by COVID and also picked up in this really important report. So things like the task force are a really important driver. But equally, we need to make sure that the accessibility housing standards, the use of disabled facilities grants, we need to make sure that the new housing transformation fund that the government has talked about to support local communities help transform themselves to be much more co-produced and user-centred to deliver better care and support at home, whatever tenure or whatever dwelling type. This report shows some of the opportunities and how groups of older adults living in a variety of settings, but in particular housing with care, can help shape that. So there's a really important piece for engagement. My final comment really is about how to make this local. We need to ensure that there is better information available. We need to make sure that there's more awareness, but also we need to address the planning system as well, so that we're looking at the way local communities plan for greater diversity. We're enabling to both mainstream this, but also look at the type of purpose-built or specialist housing that may be needed. This is not just about a special need. This is really about inclusivity. And if you're not aware of it, some of the work that the University of Stirling, and I think Professor Judith Phillips is on the participants list, they've been working closely with the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations to deliver an inclusive living toolkit for housing organisations. What would be brilliant is if we could borrow or work collaboratively to apply that within an English setting as well, in fact, more broadly across the UK. So that we've got the right tools, we've got the right guidance, we have the right research to really support policy and research into practice. Thanks, Tom.
Brilliant. As ever, Jeremy, thank you for those really lucid points and also for drawing attention to the importance of structural inequalities that underpin many of the housing decisions and choices that people are able to make in terms of their future, meeting their future housing needs and aspirations. Our fourth speaker is Abdul Ravat, who is Head of Development and Relationships at the Abbeyfield Society. Abdul has over 30 years experience of procuring affordable housing and sustaining places. At Abbeyfield, he oversees asset management and the development of new quality housing and capturing design to meet the housing, care and support needs of older people. He previously worked with the Housing Corporation, Homes and Communities Agency, where he was responsible for coordinating and representing the board's regulatory engagement, assessment of performance and investment delivery. So over to you, Abdul, for your thoughts on this particular report.
Well, thank you, Professor Thomas. Can everybody hear me first, hopefully, and see me? Great, thank you. Well, good afternoon, and yet again, it's virtually great to see you all. We seem to be getting used to these virtual events, but it's actually great to see and talk to people that are close in terms of some of the issues that are close to me, that of meeting the needs of elderly people and engaging with people genuinely looking at the demographic challenges and housing an increasingly diverse aging population. So thank you to all the partners involved in this project and for inviting me at this launch. I was thinking about how I would spend the precious minutes I've got here to talk about the report. And I thought about it from the context of a series of questions. So my first question is around why is having an inclusive and age-friendly environment in which to grow old so important in the context of an increasingly diverse aging population? Well, as the co-founder of the Aging Well in BAME communities, I recognize that whilst many older people enjoy the benefits of living longer and living better, but aging well for many from the BAME communities is a struggle. It is a time of continuous financial hardship, ill health, and reduced life expectancy. So I think that's a very important issue in terms of to take stock. But we know people will make different decisions about where and how they live as they get older. Some will want to stay living in the same home, whilst others will look to move to more manageable homes or will live with family. And some will feel that housing within a care and home setting best suits their needs. But I think the broad issue about the range of housing options available is that I would argue that there is equity, whether there is equity in provision in all parts of the country and for every social minority groups. So we know that the UK's BAME population is also aging, and soon to be published research from the 2021 census will show an increase in excess of 1.2 million people. So the fundamental question I think this research starts to consider is, so why is government, statutory bodies, social care, NHS, funders, and registered providers failing to address these demands and demographic needs, and what can be done to begin to address the fact that there are stark differences in how people experience later life? So I think in that context, this research is an important start to understand if existing people from social minority backgrounds living in care and housing environments feel that they belong and they are catered for in ways that respect their unique makeup. And I therefore applaud the research team and the providers who took part in the study. So the next point I was thinking about is how inclusive are housing and care schemes for residents from social minorities in my experience? And I thought, well, perhaps I can't go any further and look at the Abbeyfield Society itself and perhaps take a look at ourselves. So the Abbeyfield Society was established by Major Richard Carr-Gomm in 1956 and aims to care for older people, lonely, neglected and handicapped people in a new and different way, at least it was in 1956. But Richard Carr-Gomm set out some roles and actors that provided the essence of who is going to be my neighbour when I grow old. So he talked about the houses themselves, ordinary houses used for people in the neighbourhood in need of care who did not have family nor friends to look after them. He talked about the housekeepers. Each houses have paid staff to look after their residents and make them feel wanted and valued. He talked about the neighbours. Seeing old people live in their myth, the neighbours are encouraged to share the responsibility of the able for the helpless. And he talked about the helpers. With the housekeepers, there is a group of volunteers helping to address various tasks and tackle loneliness, as which we've heard from some of our other speakers. So today, the Abbeyfield Society is an international charity providing care, support, a home and companionship to older people. The organisation has over 500 homes in the UK and also operates across 11 different countries, in which staff and over 4,000 volunteers support circa 8,000 older people living in a family-like atmosphere. And Abbeyfield, as I said, offers a range of accommodation from independent living to care at home. And its overarching mission is to enhance the quality of life for older people. But the question that I've been asking is, who would I like my neighbour to be when I am old and when I am frail and when I'm unable to cope with the demands of modern life? So I've been asking that question internally as to how inclusive we are as an organisation. Internationally, we have schemes in South Africa, in Malawi, in Poland, which are catering for social minority groups. And within the UK, we have schemes that cater for the Vietnamese community. But to be honest, we need to do much, much more. And working with others and help to build understanding awareness is, I think, a good starting point. So in terms of the next question I had is that where is best practice? And I think the research actually starts to sort of unpick that. One of the privileged positions I've had as part of Aging Network is look at aspects of good practice that have emerged forward from members and organisations that promote social identity. I wanted to share some of those with you. So one of the issues was raised by Accord Group, which was looking at future-proofing existing stock. There's a high emphasis here about new build, but we need to think about the existing stock as well. So Accord provides specialist housing services for over 6,500 older people across West Midlands and beyond. Their board recognised the lack of provision of ethnic-specific extra care and sheltered accommodation, and that it's not just a question of new build. So the Aging Well Network helps shape the following key areas of focus, which I hope that we can think about going forward as we move from this research. So the questions were this: how culturally sensitive is the current design so that specific housing, dietary and faith and belief requirements can be met? What additional measures, improvements will be needed when developing new or remodeling existing provision to improve take-up? Does the service model and staffing structure adhere to this? And the need to develop marketing and digital tools to reflect wider offer and reach the different to the different social minority groups. I think the issue there is knowledge sharing and constructive challenge can help providers improve greater awareness of the need to improve social inclusion. Jeremy mentioned about the work that we've been doing in Kirklees Council and as part of their older persons housing need and preferences study. And I think that is a very good example of how the terrain is moving. So Kirklees Council commissioned research to understand what BAME needs and preference are by sub-market areas and how this would change in 5, 10, 15-year time horizons as communities and individual attitudes evolve. And so one of the unique features was asking people of my generation what were our priorities as we grow older, taking stock of changes in the extended family network. The approach and final recommendation are due out imminently, and perhaps Jeremy might know when it is because I'm trying to find out myself, and heralds, I think, a different approach to assessing identified needs and potential housing solution. It is also challenging providers like I sit on with Johnny Johnson Housing Trust to strategically question why their local offer is not reaching the local social minority group. I want to also find up the issue around aging well for Housing 21 and the fact that this was a central plank of their national conference held back in October last year, which some of us went to. Now, Housing 21 has a strategic intent to use 10% of their development program into locations where a minimum of 30% of its population is from social minority group. In fact, Housing 21 are developing co-housing models of housing and support with Birmingham City Council, and are currently developing a series of sites, one of which including with Bangladeshi women who are effectively designing and building their own community as they're moving to later life. I think finally, I wanted to think about what was one of the key takeaways that I could pick out from the report. And the thing I picked about was I really like the phrase social minority groups. It perhaps is a better helpful phrase and captures many individuals and groups in a non-judgmental manner and captures a language of inclusivity. Perhaps in due course, it can replace the more commonly used phrases that we have in terms of BNME or BME. So I too recommend the report. I feel it's part of a journey, but it's a very important step in terms of understanding to improve provision and choices for all.
Thank you very much, Abdul, for those really helpful and insightful thoughts on a range of topics. Now, I've obviously been a completely hopeless chair because we have only 10 to 15 minutes left for a discussion between panel members, and we've received quite a lot of really good questions, obviously from people who are engaged with issues around housing and inclusion and aging. So what I'm going to try and do is just focus on one or two of those areas of questioning and see how we get on in the next 10 minutes or so, and I'll give all of the panel opportunities to respond. So this means I've got to maybe start with some of the more fundamental questions that have come in from participants, and one of these actually relates to specialist housing for older people. It's that sort of fundamental question about whether age segregated housing is something that should be supported by policy at sort of national and local level. So Maggie Gilbert's comment here is about referring to social exclusion, but you're actually isolating residents from the rest of society. Shirley Ayres asks the question about, is there any research which suggests older adults would choose to live in residential communities which are segregated based upon their age? So this is that sort of fundamental question. I'm just wondering how members of the panel sort of respond to that, given the growing supply of housing with care schemes. Jane, did you want to come in on that point?
Yeah, if I could. Thank you, Thomas. I think these are really important points on the basis of the numbers of older people are significant, and the current availability of age-specific housing with care is very, very limited. And I think sometimes when we have these debates about options and models, it can be misconstrued as seeking to kind of make this a required approach in later life. I'm really clear, and I know many of my colleagues are very clear, this is about giving people choices and options in later life. We find we have huge demand for the services that we operate and new services that we build, but the number of people interested is a tiny drop in the ocean compared to the total number of older people in our society. So I think it's really important to say that older people as a group aren't a group. In the same way as we wouldn't suggest that there's one sort of preferred model of living for people between the ages of 25 and 55, we wouldn't. I think it is about giving people, so that there are definitely people who are keen to live in communities where they feel engaged in the local community and they feel a sense of safety and security by living with people of their own age group. There are other people who absolutely want to live in intergenerational communities, want to remain in homes that they may have lived in for many years. So I think it's an important principle that has been raised by a number of those questioners, which is to say, actually the bigger picture is we need to make sure that we are inclusive and diverse in any housing setting, regardless of age. But we're particularly, obviously this piece of work has looked at housing with care communities, and yes, people are self-selecting. People who are making choices are looking to some of those people, and you know, we will probably all have our own views about what we might like in our later life as well. So I think it's important that there are choices available to people, and this isn't about saying that there should be a sort of one-size-fits-all approach.
Thank you.
I think I would add on to that, that at pretty well any stage of adult life, people who have their own means, people who have the ability to buy their own house, make choices about the sorts of housing, and usually it's housing which is related to the stage of life that they are at and the way that housing is built. That means that they are living alongside people who are at that same, i.e. people with small children or whatever. Now, I think it's wrong to say that just because somebody doesn't necessarily have their own independent means, that they can't have that choice, which is to go and live with a bunch of people who are at a similar stage of life and who may in general share needs and so on. But exactly as Jane said, people are individuals, and we shouldn't be dragooning people into being what we think they should be. We should just be giving them options.
Jeremy, please.
I mentioned in my sort of opening remarks about lifetime homes, lifetime neighbourhoods. What's really important about the principles set out in that is around inclusivity, because actually the principles are, whether it is about specialist housing or mainstream housing, is looking at the common factors where we can create more age-friendly approaches irrespective of the cohort of age you're in. So it's not about just being an older person. It could be a younger person. A lifetime home enables somebody with a wheelchair, but equally somebody with a pram or with a guide dog. So again, it is about taking an inclusive approach. But the trick is, and what organisations like Anchor and others do, is really about how to then marry that with what are the issues around health and social care needs, so that you can wrap around a person-centred approach, whether it's an ordinary retirement living, or if that person may need extra care, or indeed residential or nursing care. So again, we need to think much more person-centred, and I'd echo what Baroness Barker was saying around that, and then think about how we can have a broader suite of inclusive design standards that can sort of be adapted to the life course, or you can adapt your existing stock, existing home too.
Yeah,
can I come in there? Yes, please.
Yeah,
do,
sure.
Abdul.
I think for me, there's a number of issues here. I mean, firstly, as I said in my slides, in my presentation, we're not going to build our way out of it. So actually making better use of the existing stock is a key priority, because I think Lord Best keeps telling us that, we're at a build rate which has been the lowest it's ever been. And therefore, we have to accept the fact that there isn't enough of the government's housing resources going to this area. The other issue for me is this whole notion about intergenerational housing. And certainly within some BAME communities, the pandemic has clearly shown that actually large overcrowded households were particularly challenged in terms of being able to shield themselves. So what the solution is I think going to mean very different for different people. And it's also about location, because in some location there will be that physical demand and physical possibilities, and as I said, in other locations that might not be the case. But fundamentally, I think the issue for me is from a local authority planning point of view, how many Section 106 have we seen which prioritizes older person housing as part of a new growth area? It's always probably at the last end of that. And that's where I think some of the policy changes could help in terms of developing understanding across the sector that older people housing matters and should be at the start of our agenda, not at the end.
I mean, this is my own question, which is always a risk, isn't it, when you're chairing? But I'm just wondering about, a lot of the housing developments that are being built now may not meet the, what we would regard as a more inclusive set of values and standards. Is that we can see around us examples of examples of housing developments that, you know, we'd think, oh, that's not quite, you know, it's not cutting edge. It's looks like, you know, something that's been tried and tested in the past. Do we need more innovative forms of housing that add to the level of choice, but also then how do, you know, picking up on Baroness Barker's point, how do we make that accessible also to people who may not have the means to access things that, you know, housing that is perhaps more expensive?
Tom, can I respond?
Sorry, Paul, go on.
Sure. In the course of doing this research, we've come across some really exciting schemes that do, I believe, have that innovative design. So, for example, schemes that integrate local resources and shops that are used by people in the community, in the broader community, as well as living within the scheme. The co-location of local resources such as libraries, community libraries within the scheme, which plays a really important role for the residents in terms of access to services and amenities, but also brings in people from outside the community. And on that point, we saw some examples of this, and this came up in our knowledge exchange events with stakeholders. In terms of creating innovation in the social life of schemes, making sure that there is involvement of local groups within scheme life, so that local groups such as dementia-friendly cafes can come in and use the communal spaces and the cafes on site. That helps kind of break down some of those community barriers that perhaps we think about when we talk about age-segregated communities, and you would hope would have a flow-on effect in terms of creating more inclusive environments for residents within the scheme. And I just want to briefly go back to the comment about age segregation within this type of housing. I appreciate where this concern's coming from, but I just want to make two observations. We have to be careful we don't create a dichotomy between intergenerational housing and older people's housing. In our study, the youngest participants were late 50s, and the oldest participant was 95. So that's multiple generations. That is actually intergenerational housing in multiple generations in the one scheme. And we had some people in their 60s who were still working in paid employment. And we had some people who had disabilities or chronic health conditions that were more dependent on care and support from others. And the other observation I want to make is that many of the residents we spoke to, they came from the local community. So they'd moved into the scheme and their original house or their former dwelling was down the road or in the next suburb along. And so they still maintained really important local connections. So I think it comes back to having the choices and the availability more universally in relation to these type of schemes across communities.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Paul. I'm sort of looking at the clock here and realizing that we're coming very close to the end of our allotted time. And as Mark Venning has said in the chat, that it's too bad that the session wasn't a bit longer and that there isn't enough time to respond to some of the really excellent questions that were posted in the Q&A. There's some really good questions there around the role of digital technologies in housing with care and support schemes. One of the things that we can do, I'm advised, is that we can download the various questions that have been asked, and these can be shared with the speakers after today's event. So we'll certainly do that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to wrap up in the minute that's available and to say thank you very much to the research team that have led on the DICE study, and also to the very many people who supported the project, including on the Impact and Advisory board. That you can see where this has been of direct benefit to the project over time. And I'd like to thank in particular the four distinguished panelists who've joined us today, Jeremy Porteus, Abdul, Ravat, Baroness Barker, and Jane Ashcroft. Thank you so much for your insights into the work that's been shared. I'd also like to finish up by just thanking everybody who's joined the session today. The next ILC webinar is going to be the launch of their new report on improving vaccination take-up among patients with chronic conditions, a really topical report. This was happening at 1 p.m. GMT on Thursday, the 3rd of February. You can find out about ILC's latest webinars and keep up to date with all of the ILC's news on their website at ilcuk.org.uk, and you can follow them. You can follow them on Twitter at ILC UK. You can join their mailing list and subscribe to their YouTube channel. It's very difficult to avoid ILC UK unless you really make a concerted effort to do that, but I wouldn't advise that at all. So we hope to welcome you to another webinar or an event in the near future. Thanks everyone once again for joining today's launch.